Welcome to another episode of Love and Game Film, the podcast about sports movies and cinematic real-life sports stories. I am your host, JC DeLeon. You can find me on Twitter at JCDeLeon1. Same thing on Instagram. You can follow the show on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok at Love Game Film. And if you know me, you'll know a few things about me almost immediately. I root unabashedly for LeBron James, the Chicago Cubs. I love movies. I love cats, which might be kind of weird, but whatever. One of the best things about sports, or even movies for that matter, is that they are for everyone. There's no discrimination in fandom, no matter your ethnicity, race, political affiliation, religious belief, etc. If you love a team or an athlete, it's for you. Contrary to popular belief, sports isn't just for the boys. Women like sports just as much, if not more so, than men. In my family in particular, it's my mom who's the big sports addict, and my dad likes the Dallas Cowboys, he likes the San Antonio Spurs, but for the most part, his sports fandom is a little more subdued than that of my mom. And sometimes women fans aren't treated all that great. And other times, the support can be misguided. Just take a look at the NFL and how much they say they support women. But when you look at how they discipline their athletes when it comes to their infractions, betting on sports is a lot more serious than beating on your girlfriend. Just take a look at the Calvin Ridley suspension. We'll talk a little bit more about sports gambling and that story with Calvin Ridley as it comes to light later on in a few weeks. But today, as of this recording, which I'm recording on International Women's Day, but for the month of March in 2022, it's also Women's History Month. And in that vein, I'd like to share a couple of stories with you that bring about one of the biggest issues that not only women athletes face, but women all over the world continue to face, and that's the wage gap. And there's some good and there's some bad of late. And why would we highlight the bad, you might ask? Well, as important as it is to help out women's sports by showcasing the things that are worthy of cinematic intrigue one day, it's just as important to point out the injustices that women athletes face even today. The gap in salaries, facility amenities, endorsement opportunities. There are so many ways in which women aren't treated nearly as well as their male counterparts, and yet they persist. They continue to play the games that they love, sometimes overseas because the pay is better. Overseas, they're separated from friends and loved ones, sometimes in war-torn countries. And why do they do this? It's because they love the game. Whether it's basketball or soccer or volleyball. And as fans, we should love them right back. In February of this year, women's U.S. national soccer team reached a settlement with the U.S. Soccer Federation that will guarantee equal pay with the men's teams, as well as offer players millions in back pay, ending a 6-year gender discrimination case that resonated through American sports. The difference in pay between the U.S. men's national team and the U.S. women's national team was appalling for so long, especially given the fact that the U.S. women's team performs at a much higher level than the men's team. The difference in World Cup performance is astounding. From 2002 to 2015, the U.S. women's team won 81% of their matches versus 41% for the men. And the women have appeared in 50% of the finals. Now, there are some that might argue that if you were to look at the overall amount of money that women have been paid, the women's national team has been paid versus the men, you might find some people pointing out the fact that the women's team actually made a little bit more than the men, and that's only because of the unfair bonus structure that the men's national team had laid upon their feet. When the men's team wins versus top-tier opponents, they get a bonus of $17.6 thousand. If they tie, they get 8.1. When the women win versus top tier opponents, they get $8.5 thousand, and if they tie, they get $1.8 thousand. Versus mid tier, the men's bonus drops to $12.5 thousand in a win, 6.3 in a tie, 6.5 in a win for the men, 1.3 for a tie. Versus bottom tier opponents, that drops to 9.4, 6.3 in a tie. The women in a win versus a bottom tier opponent get $5.3 thousand, and in a tie they get nothing. World Cup qualifiers. In World Cup qualifiers for a win, the men get $18,000, $10,000 in a tie. The women in a World Cup qualifier get $3,000 in a tie. They get $500. Now earlier I said in World Cup qualifiers, the women won 81% of their matches versus the men only winning 41%. And in that scale, yeah, the women might have been paid a little more. But that's only because they had to vastly, to an embarrassing degree, perform much better than the men's national team. Megan Rapinoe, leader of the U.S. women's national team, had this to say.
Obviously, we've been in this for a long time, and, coming from a long history of women that have fought to put this sport in a better place. So, I think pride comes to mind. Just incredibly proud of the women on this team and all the women who this lawsuit represents. Our greater extended team. Obviously, we have lawyers and strategists and media people to help us. Everybody's been in our corner the entire time. I feel like the thing I look forward to and am really proud of is that the justice comes in the next generation, never having to go through what we went through. It's equal pay across the board from here on out, and I'm looking forward to continuing to grow the sport and to have this be a moment we look back on that signals a new U.S. soccer that we can all be extremely proud of.
Now, with most issues, there are two sides, and there are some that don't consider this a win because the U.S. women's national team originally sued for $66 million. And this settlement for $22 million is seen as an insult in the eyes of some of their former teammates like Hope Solo. On her Instagram, she said, "This settlement is not a huge win. It's heartbreaking and infuriating. The promise of equal pay from the Federation and back pay for a select group of players isn't equal pay, and it's not what this fight was about. Read the fine print. Contingent upon the negotiation of a new collective bargaining agreement. It doesn't exist yet and is not guaranteed. If the players had ever been successful in negotiating an equal CBA, there would be no reason to sue the Federation in the first place. 6 years ago, we started the fight for equal pay. Something I'm very proud to say I led when I pushed to bring on a new Players Association Executive Director, Rich Nichols. Someone I knew would truly fight for us and give us the tools to challenge a federation that marginalized us for decades. His strategy to file the EEOC complaint was the boldest action any team had ever taken. It wasn't an easy task of anyone, and at the time, the decision went against the wishes of other players on this team, now being called the leaders of the fight. Throughout the entire process, Megan Rapinoe and Alex Morgan were the two most agreeable with the Federation, and to this day continue to accept terms that are nowhere near what we set out to do. They both know that this is not a win. They know it's an easy out to a fight they were never really in. So, some pretty harsh words from Hope Solo. And you also do have opponents that will bring up what I mentioned earlier, in that the women might have made a little bit more than the men. And in endorsements, some have Nike contracts, whereas some of the men don't. But that doesn't shine a light on the real issue, in that the simple job of playing soccer for your country, the base salary should be the same. Because both the men and the women are essentially doing the same thing. Playing soccer for this country. And in the end, the most important thing, even though they settled, is that they made this first gigantically important step. And why is it important? Because there are still instances of professional women's teams not getting anywhere near the same treatment as the men.
I sat out 5 seasons because I get paid 5 to 8 times more overseas than I do here in the WNBA. Wow. And it's hard when you want to be at home. America is home for me now, and I want to spend as much time as I can here. But a lot of women go overseas and spend 8 months in China or Europe to make their main money. So it's hard when you have the best league in the world, but we're not treated like the best athletes in the world. I pay to upgrade myself. That's one part of the CBA that I can't stand, is that my team, my club can't look after me and put me in first. I personally don't even fly myself economy. I haven't seen the back of a plane since the WNBA season was over. I don't fit back there. So the fact that I have to pay to upgrade my flight to get to work and perform, it's crazy to me. But, we got owners in the league that want to do so much more for us, but they can't.
The WNBA is a great example. Recently, the New York Liberty faced sanctions from the league that resulted in a $500,000 fine, and very well could have been removed as a franchise entirely. And what was their egregious infraction, you ask? They chartered a flight to a winery in Napa as a team-building event. They also, from time to time, chartered flights for their players to get to and from games. The same things that NBA teams do multiple times every week for their players. As first reported by Howard Megdal of Sports Illustrated, the New York Liberty chartered flights in the second half of the 2021 season, and at the moment, the current collective bargaining agreement of the WNBA players are subject to forbid this because it is deemed a competitive advantage. And one could see why. When every other team in the league is forced to fly commercial, yes, I suppose chartered flights could be a competitive advantage. But that's not seeing the real problem. WNBA players and teams aren't afforded the same luxuries as their male counterparts. In some instances, they're barely even given a chance to succeed. This isn't the first unfair injustice to fall upon the Liberty's lap. In 2018, the Liberty were moved from Madison Square Garden, where they'd played since the league's inception in 1997, to the Westchester County Garden in White Plains, New York, which is 30 minutes from Manhattan. Despite drawing nearly 10,000 fans a game at MSG, the Liberty were shuttled out to the suburbs to play in a 5,000-seat facility. Naturally, their attendance dropped by 70%. That same year, the Washington Mystics also moved from the 20,000-seat Capital One Arena to a 4,200-seat arena in Congress Heights. That year, the Mystics were a team good enough to make it to the WNBA Finals. But are chartered flights really a competitive advantage? Some opposing players, WNBA players, don't think so. Gabrielle Union even voiced her displeasure on an Instagram post. This sounds ass backwards and an open desire by some owners to make sure that women athletes don't have the same advantage as male pro athletes. A damn shame. 3 years of private flights for the entire league and there's an issue? Make it make sense. She's referring to a proposition made by the New York Liberty owners Joe and Clara Tsai, in which they made a proposal that would guarantee free chartered flights for every WNBA team, and this was turned away by a WNBA owner vote. And travel has long been an issue with the WNBA. Despite their rising popularity and ratings, the money just doesn't seem to be there apparently. And it's led to some really disheartening stories. The Las Vegas Aces had to forfeit a game that had major playoff implications in 2018 because of disastrous weather and canceled flights. I know that no one can control the weather, but they can't control when an airline overbooks a flight either. What is normally a 4.5-hour flight from Las Vegas to Washington, D.C. became a more than 26-hour road trip by bus. This was documented on a lot of players' Instagrams and social media at the time. This drew huge displeasure from WNBA fans. In the end, they showed up to the Mystics Arena just a couple of hours before tip-off, and they decided that they were too tired and too frustrated, and it wasn't in their best interest and safety for the team to play, and so they forfeited a game because they had shown up but refused to play. And there are a lot more stories that highlight the wage gap between, like I said, not only athletes, women athletes, but women all over the country. And there's no reason they shouldn't make equal pay as men. And at this point in the podcast, if you're against equal pay for women, and I don't know why you're still listening if you are, and you can go back to my episode 0 and some of the things that I believe in and politically, if you're not aligned with something like this, or my opinion of Colin Kaepernick, which you would also know if you know me pretty well, if you're against these things, I don't know why you'd still be listening, because let's face it, if you lean that way, this podcast is not going to be for you. But if you are against this thing and you are listening to this podcast, and you may be wondering what the big deal is, what's the harm? After all, women have gone all this time without equal pay, and while things might be getting better, why the urgency now? Well, besides there being no time like the present, you have situations related to, of all things, the Russia-Ukraine war. WNBA players have a short season. It's usually towards the tail end of the NBA season. I believe it's 3 or 4 months long versus the 9-month season that the NBA is. And so, because the WNBA season isn't as long, oftentimes WNBA players play overseas. Not only because they can get more playing time in doing the thing that they love, but they can also get more lucrative contracts than they can get in the US. Some would call this supplementing their income. But I have news for you folks. WNBA players, their end goal is not to play in the WNBA. Their end goal is to get paid doing what they love and to play on the most prestigious stages in the world, which unfortunately for women basketball players is not the WNBA. It's the Olympics. That's what women basketball players care about. They care about the Olympics, and they care about the teams that they play for in the quote-unquote off-season. They don't supplement their WNBA income by playing overseas. The WNBA is their side gig. They simply get paid more to play overseas, and that's not right. If you don't know who Brittney Griner is, let me tell you. Brittney Griner, she's one of the greatest WNBA players of all time. While she wasn't the first to dunk in a game, she's the first to have had the ability to do it regularly in games and in traffic. At 6'9", she's also a defensive powerhouse. This week, WNBA fans and subsequently the nation were horrified to find out that Brittney has been held captive in Russia after being arrested for being in possession of a small amount of hashish oil for a vape pen. Support campaigns from fellow WNBA players, celebrities, and fans have begun, starting with the hashtag #FreeBritney. As of this recording, there's been very little information about the kind of treatment that she's been receiving while she's been detained in Russia. The penalty for her alleged crime could be 10 years. And while it doesn't seem likely that she'll ever see that kind of time, there doesn't seem to be any certainty about her release either. And it didn't have to come to this. She shouldn't have been forced to have to play in a country like Russia. Now granted, there's a lot of other countries she could have played for. Kelsey Plum, one of the best NBA players in the year, 6th person of the year last year, plays in Germany. Katie Lou Samuelson of the Seattle Storm, one of the better up-and-coming players, plays in Spain with her sister. A number of WNBA players have to play overseas. They're not all like Candace Parker, who has a really sweet gig over at TBS and inside the NBA. We have to do better. As fans, we have to do better, and we have to demand of ownership of the leagues that people stand up for women, and that they not only get paid equally, they get treated equally. And in that vein, we'd like to throw our support to Brittney Griner and hope that she returns home safely. #FreeBritney. We'll take a quick break and come back with our guest shortly. Thank you.